Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever softness surrounds you right now. The pillow beneath your head, the weight of a blanket pulled up to your shoulders, the particular warmth of a room that has grown quiet for the night. Let the world outside your window become very far away, because we are going somewhere else tonight. Somewhere older than almost anything you can imagine. Somewhere that sits at the edge of two continents, where the wind comes in cold off the water, and the stars above are so thick with light that on clear nights you can almost count them. Almost, if you weren't slowly drifting away. We are going to Troy. Not the ruined stones of a museum site, not the painted scenes from a classroom or a cinema screen, but the real and breathing city of bronze and limestone, of torchlit ramparts and salt wind, of a people who woke each morning inside walls that they believed the gods themselves had helped raise from the earth. We are going to stand on those walls tonight. We are going to take the watch. And as the hours of the night roll slowly past, as the stars wheel overhead in their ancient and unhurried courses, we are going to let that place settle over us like smoke from a low fire. Warm, atmospheric, and gently sleep-inducing. Troy sits at the northwestern tip of what we now call Turkey, a place the ancient world knew as Anatolia or Asia Minor. It guards a narrow neck of water called the Hellespont, what we know today as the Dardanelles, the only passage between the Aegean Sea to the west and the Black Sea to the east. Even today, if you were to stand on that hillside, you would feel the strategic weight of the location pressing in around you. To your west, the sea. To your south, a broad and gently sloping plain, bisected by a river the ancient Greeks called the Scamander, its waters threading silver through grassland and marshland and farmland toward the distant shore. To your north, more sea. And behind you, rising in a long ridge, the hills that shelter the city from the worst of the eastern winds. The city the archaeologists call Troy 6, the Troy that most closely matches the one Homer described in the Iliad, was a place of genuine grandeur in the Bronze Age world. Not enormous by the standards we are accustomed to today, but substantial and wealthy and powerfully fortified. The citadel at its heart measured roughly 200 meters by 300 meters, its perimeter traced by walls of close-fitted limestone blocks that still partially stand in the hillside of Hisarlik today. Around this inner citadel, a lower city spread across approximately 30 hectares, home to workshops, houses, paved streets, and the ordinary rhythms of a functioning settlement. Estimates place the population of the Greater Troy area at somewhere around 10,000 people, a significant city for its age and its geography. The location was not chosen carelessly. Troy had existed in some form since roughly 3000 BCE, rebuilt and reborn through layer upon layer of habitation, each generation constructing on the foundation stones of the one before. By the time of the Bronze Age Troy that concerns us tonight, the city of roughly 1200 BCE, the city that the Hittite records called Wilusa and that Homer called Ilios, it had become the most important city in the entire northern Aegean world. Ships sailing from the Aegean towards the Black Sea had to pass through those narrow straits just below. Prevailing winds made the passage unpredictable, often forcing vessels to stand at anchor near the coast for days at a time, waiting for favorable conditions. And while they waited, They needed supplies. They needed fresh water. They needed to trade. Troy was the place that provided all of those things, and in providing them, Troy grew rich. That richness showed in the walls. Tonight, we are going to stand inside those walls. We are going to take the night watch with the sentries of ancient Troy, soldiers who stood in the cold wind above the Trojan plain and kept their eyes on the fires of the Greek encampment below, who listened to the sounds the darkness made, who watched the stars for signals the priests and the augurs had told them to look for. They lived and breathed and feared and hoped, and in the slow hours of the night, when there was nothing to do but keep watch and think, they must have wondered, as people have always wondered in quiet moments, whether all of this would last. It did not, but for now it is standing. The torches are burning. The watch has just been set. Come up on the walls with us, and let the night begin. Section 2. The City of Wilusa, Troy before the war. Before we can understand what it meant to guard these walls, we have to understand what was inside them. And to understand that, we need to go back a little further than the war, back to the city itself. The city as it existed before the Greeks ever appeared on the horizon, before the 1,000 ships, before the 10 years of siege, before any of it. Because Troy was not just a setting for a famous story. It was a real place with a real history that stretched back far further than the war, and that history is one of the most quietly remarkable things about it. The hill of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, the site now recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site and almost universally accepted by archaeologists as the location of Homer's Troy, has been inhabited continuously for over 5,000 years. 5,000 years. When you stand on that hillside today and look out across the Dardanelles toward the faint blue line of the European shore, you are standing on the compressed memory of dozens of generations of human habitation, each layer of civilization resting on the bones of the one before, like pages in a very slow book. Archaeologists who have excavated the site over the past century and a half have identified at least 9 major layers of occupation, labeled simply Troy 1 through Troy 9. The earliest, Troy 1, dates to approximately 3000 BCE, roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization, contemporary with the construction of the first monuments at Stonehenge. Even then, the people who lived on that hilltop had understood the value of their position and had built a small but genuine fortification around their settlement. They were not simply farmers who had built a fence. They were already thinking strategically about their geography. Each successive city grew upon the rubble of the last. Troy II, which dates to around 2500 BCE, was significantly more prosperous than its predecessor. When the German businessman turned archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated this level in 1873, he found within it a cache of extraordinary treasure: gold jewelry, silver vessels, bronze weapons, objects of electrum and ivory, that he famously and incorrectly declared to be the treasure of the legendary King Priam. He was off by more than 1,000 years, but the find spoke to the genuine wealth that had accumulated on this hilltop over centuries of strategic trade.
The treasure is now partially in Moscow, partially in Berlin, and partially scattered across several other institutions, a dispersal that carries its own complicated modern history. But that is a story for another night.
The city that most closely matches Homer's description, the Troy of the war, is almost certainly Troy 6, or possibly the closely related Troy 7a, both of which date to the period between roughly 1750 and 1100 BCE. It was during the Troy 6 phase that the great limestone walls were built, the walls that would protect the city for centuries, and that would, in the end, resist direct assault for 10 full years before being circumvented not by force but by cunning. During this period, Troy was deeply connected to the broader networks of Bronze Age civilization. The Hittites, who governed a powerful empire across much of Anatolia during the second millennium BCE, referred to a western Anatolian city called Wilusa in their diplomatic records. Several Hittite clay tablets, dating between 1400 and 1200 BCE, mention this place and describe political relationships, treaty obligations, and commercial agreements that clearly suggest a sophisticated and well-established city-state. Most scholars today accept that Wilusa is Troy. The names are closely related linguistically, with the Hittite form preserving a sound that had dropped out of Greek by Homer's time. The Greek name Ilios, from which we also get the word Iliad, appears to be derived from the same root. This documentary evidence is remarkable because it means Troy was not simply a mythological invention. The Hittites were meticulous record keepers. Their archives contain tens of thousands of clay tablets, covering everything from royal decrees to grain inventories to diplomatic correspondence. And the appearance of Wilusa in their records places it firmly in the historical landscape of the Late Bronze Age. The city had treaties, it had kings whose names were recorded, it had political relationships with the great powers of its day. Inside the walls of this Bronze Age Troy, life was layered and multifaceted. The citadel at the top of the hill housed the palace, the administrative buildings, the temples, and the residences of the ruling class. The lower city, spreading across those 30 hectares below, contained the workshops and the houses of ordinary people. Weavers and metal workers and merchants and farmers, people who left behind fragments of their lives in the soil, pottery sherds, murex shells from the purple dye industry, grinding stones, storage vessels, bronze tools. These are the quieter voices of history, less dramatic than the palace, but no less real. The plains below the citadel were agricultural land, and the river Scamander brought fresh water down from the hills to the east, making the land around Troy fertile and productive. Wheat and barley grew on the plain. Horses were kept. Troy 6 is notable for introducing the domesticated horse to the Aegean region, a detail that fits interestingly with Homer's repeated description of the Trojans as horse-taming people. Fishing boats worked the nearby coast. Merchant vessels stopped at the harbour below the hill, trading wine and oil and tin and copper, and the long chains of commodities that connected the Mediterranean world into a single, breathing economy. The walls of the Late Bronze Age citadel were constructed from close-fitted blocks of limestone ashlar, carefully cut and shaped stone, fitted together with precision rather than merely stacked. The circuit of the citadel walls ran approximately 550 meters in total circumference, enclosing that roughly 200 by 300 meter citadel plateau. At their base, these walls were up to 5 meters thick, 5 meters, nearly 16 feet of solid stone. And during the Bronze Age, they were topped with additional superstructures of mud brick and timber that would have brought the total height to more than 9 meters, or approximately 30 feet.
From the plain below, looking up the slope of the hill toward the walls, the effect would have been formidable.
What makes the Troy 6 walls architecturally distinctive, and what connects them to the broader world of late Bronze Age fortification, is their so-called sawtooth construction. Rather than running in a single straight or gently curved line, the walls were built in a series of segments, each measuring somewhere between 7 and 10 meters in length, joined at shallow angles. Not quite a zigzag, but a subtle repeating offset that broke up the long surface of the wall into an articulated series of overlapping planes. Archaeologists have noted that this same construction technique appears in Mycenaean citadels, the great fortress cities of Bronze Age Greece that were the ancestral homeland of the very people who would one day besiege Troy. Whether this reflects shared architectural traditions, common influences from elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, or some more direct cultural exchange between the Aegean world and northwestern Anatolia, is still a matter of scholarly discussion. But the visual effect of this sawtooth pattern on the walls of Troy would have been striking, an impression not of a simple flat barrier, but of a continuously turning, angled surface that would have complicated the approach of any force attempting to scale or batter it. The walls also had a notable outward batter, meaning they sloped outward slightly at the base rather than rising vertically. This is a feature common to many ancient fortifications, practical for structural stability, but also visually imposing. A wall that seems to lean toward you as you approach carries its own quiet message about permanence and power. UNESCO, in designating the archaeological site a World Heritage location, specifically noted 23 sections of the citadel's defensive walls that survive, along with 11 gates, a paved stone ramp, and the lower portions of 5 defensive bastions. The bastions and watchtowers are particularly important for our story tonight, because these were the elevated platforms from which the watch was kept. Troy 6's walls were overlooked by several rectangular watchtowers, projecting from the main line of the wall at intervals to provide covering fields of observation and defense. The most imposing of these was the northeastern bastion, a massive projection measuring roughly 59 feet by 26 feet, angled to dominate the approach from the plain to the north. From the top of this bastion, on a clear night, a sentry would have been able to see for a considerable distance across the surrounding landscape, the river winding across the plain, the coast beyond, and any fires burning in the darkness below. The gates of Troy deserve particular attention, because gates are more than entrances. In the ancient world, a gate was a threshold in the deepest sense, a place where inside and outside met, where the protected and the unprotected worlds came into contact, where you declared yourself and were assessed before being allowed to pass. Troy 6 had 5 gates piercing its citadel walls. The eastern gate, with its overlapping wall lines that created a protected corridor of approach, was particularly well designed defensively. Streets from the gates were paved with drained cobblestone, leading into the interior of the citadel on a gentle upward slope. In the mythology of the war, the most famous of Troy's gates was the Scaean Gate, the great western gate that opened toward the plain of battle, through which the warriors rode out each morning to fight, and through which they staggered back each evening, wounded or exhausted or both. The name Scaean is sometimes translated simply as the left-hand gate, a directional designation suggesting it was the gate to the left as you approached the city from the plain. Homer describes warriors gathering at this gate, women watching from the towers above it, the aged king Priam sitting in its shadow to observe the fighting below.
The gate bore the weight of the entire war in some sense. It was the dividing line between everything the Trojans were trying to hold on to and everything they were trying to keep out. At night, of course, the gates were closed and barred. Heavy wooden beams, bronze-fitted, were set across the gate passages. The approach ramps and the areas immediately outside the walls would have been watched carefully. Any movement in the darkness outside the walls would have drawn immediate attention from the sentries above.
The interior of the citadel was terraced. The hill's natural topography stepped into a series of rising levels, each carrying buildings appropriate to its elevation. The outermost and best preserved terrace hosted freestanding multi-story houses of stone, the residences of Troy's elite, built in a style that mirrored the walls themselves, solid, ashlar-faced, intended to last. Higher up, the palace of the king would have dominated the summit of the hill, its upper stories offering views in every direction, across the plain to the Greek encampment, across the straits toward the European coast, back into the interior of Anatolia, where the roads led to the Hittite world. This is the city whose walls the sentries walked each night. This is the stone they pressed their hands against in the cold darkness. This is what they were keeping. Section 4. Who guards the walls? The soldiers of Troy. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the darkness be comfortable. Think about what it would feel like to be standing high above the earth on a cool night, with the world spread out below you in all its quiet enormity. This is where we are now. This is where we stay for a while. The soldiers who guarded the walls of Troy were a diverse and complicated group, perhaps more diverse than most people imagine when they think of Troy, which tends to call up images of a small, tight community besieged by a foreign enemy. In fact, Troy during the war, if we are following Homer's account, which blends genuine Bronze Age memory with centuries of oral tradition and poetic embellishment, was a city with allies drawn from a wide arc of the ancient world.
The Trojan warriors, as Homer describes them, were equipped and armed in the manner of late Bronze Age combat, which is to say, impressively armed by the standards of their world, though in a manner that looks somewhat different from the classical Greek warfare that most people picture when they think of ancient battles. Bronze was the metal of the age, and it was expensive. Wealthy warriors wore bronze helmets, some of the wide-brimmed crested type that appear in Aegean artwork of the period, some of the simpler bowl-shaped variety, along with bronze breastplates and greaves to protect their lower legs. Shields were large, either the great full-body tower shields that appear in earlier artwork, or the smaller, more maneuverable figure-eight shields that became common later in the Bronze Age. Swords were bronze, their blades either leaf-shaped or straight, designed primarily for slashing rather than thrusting. Spears were the primary weapon of most fighters, with spear points cast from bronze and hafts of ash wood. The most elite warriors would have had chariots, the Bronze Age equivalent of cavalry, used for rapid movement across the battlefield, and in some fighting styles as a mobile platform from which an aristocratic warrior could dismount to engage an opponent before remounting and withdrawing. The plains of Troy, with their relatively level terrain, broken only by the river and a few low rises, would have been well suited to chariot use, and Homer's account is full of chariots rattling across the plain. But the men on the wall at night at every hour were not all elite warriors in polished bronze. The wall had to be walked at every hour,
and the more routine portions of the night watch would have been staffed by ordinary soldiers, men who perhaps wore leather armor or padded linen, who carried spears and knives and the practical weapons of everyday soldiering, rather than the elaborate matched sets of bronze that a wealthy aristocrat might display. These were men who had families in the city below, who had come to the walls because it was their duty, who stood their watch in the cold and thought about their supper and their beds, and the morning that would come when they could finally go back down to the warmth. A typical night watch in the ancient world was divided into periods. The Trojans, living in a world shaped by the same broad Mediterranean conventions as most surrounding cultures, would likely have organized the night into watches of several hours each, with guards rotating through their stations and reliefs coming up from below at regular intervals. The watch officer, some senior soldier or minor noble whose rank entitled him to the responsibility of the night's security, would have made circuits of the entire wall at intervals, checking that every post was manned, every sentry alert, every approach visible.
The sentries on the towers would have had torches or small fires nearby, not large enough to destroy their night vision, carefully placed to illuminate the immediate area of the wall top without silhouetting the guards against the darkness behind them. They would have been looking outward, always outward, scanning the plain below for any movement in the darkness, any shifting of fires in the Greek camp, any sound that didn't belong to the ordinary sounds of the night. Now we are going to slow everything down. The words are going to come more gently now. Think of them as water, spreading quietly across the floor of your mind, filling the low places first. Let them carry you. Evening is falling over Troy.
Down in the city below you, torches are being kindled. The evening lamps are lit in windows along the narrow streets. Smoke rises from cooking fires in the lower city's houses. A dozen thin threads of grey-blue ascending into the cooling air, bringing with them the faint smell of wood ash and something savoury, something warm. People are moving through the streets of the lower city, the last business of the day being completed. Merchants pulling their goods in from the open fronts of their stalls, water carriers making a final trip before the night makes the paths between the lower city and the cisterns difficult to navigate safely. Children are being called inside. Dogs are settling into their evening places in doorways and corners. Up here on the wall, the changing of the watch is happening. It is not a ceremony of any particular drama. It is practical and quiet, the way that necessary things done at the end of a long day tend to be. The outgoing sentries, men who have stood here since the afternoon, who are cold and hungry, and whose feet ache from the hard stone of the rampart walk, are giving their brief reports to the men who are relieving them. Nothing unusual. The Greek camp is where it has been. No movement near the wall during the late afternoon. The fires on the plain are burning normally. The gate is secured. A torch on the south tower needs replacing. Then the handover is complete, and the afternoon men go down. And the night men are alone. The night sentries settle into their posts. There is a particular quality to this moment, the moment when the day's noise and activity falls away and the night opens up around you, when the world becomes both larger and quieter at the same time. A man standing on the wall of Troy at this hour would feel that quality acutely. The plain below is vast and darkening. The sea to the west is a long, dark line. The river catches the last of the sky's light and holds it in slow-moving curves across the dark plain. And across that plain, in the distance, but not at so great a distance that you cannot make out individual fires beginning to emerge from the gathering dark, the Greek encampment is stirring with its own evening life. There is something strange about knowing your enemies are close enough to see their fires, something that pulls at a person, a complicated attention that is not quite fear and not quite fascination, but something that combines elements of both. The sentries of Troy knew this feeling intimately. They had known it for years, because by the time of the events Homer describes in the Iliad, the siege was already 9 years old, and the men on the wall had been watching those fires for 9 years, through 9 summers and 9 winters, through 9 cycles of the seasons turning slowly above the same unchanged plain. The senior watch officer walks his circuit. He moves from tower to tower, exchanging the quiet words that confirm each post is active and aware. At the northeastern bastion, the largest of the towers, the one that commands the widest view of the plain, he pauses for a while, looking out at the panorama that the height allows. The Greek camp is lit with perhaps 1,000 fires now, spread across the curve of the shore. Beyond it, just barely visible in the last light, the black shapes of the Greek ships are drawn up on the beach, hull to hull, their masts stripped for the night. The sight has not changed in 9 years, and yet he still looks, still scans, because the one night that he stops looking carefully is the night that something changes. He moves on. Behind him, the city of Troy breathes in the gathering dark, its 10,000 people settling toward sleep, trusting the men on the walls. Section 6. The Plain of Scamander. What the Sentry Saw. The world seen from high walls at night is a different world from the one seen at ground level. Height changes everything. It compresses distances, flattens the landscape into a kind of map, makes patterns visible that are invisible to someone standing in the middle of them. The sentries of Troy, looking out from their elevated positions on the walls of the citadel, would have seen the Trojan plain spread out below them in a way that was both informative and, in its quiet enormity, strangely beautiful. The plain itself was wide and gently sloping, running from the base of the hill where the city stood, down toward the coastline several kilometers to the southwest. In the Bronze Age, this coastline was closer than it is today. Centuries of sediment carried down by the rivers have since pushed the shoreline further out, and at the time of the war, the sea would have been visible from the walls, a dark and constant presence at the edge of the world. The bay near which the Greeks drew up their ships was within sight of the city walls, a detail that would have given the siege its particular psychological character. The besieged could always see the besiegers' ships, always see the means of their eventual destruction,
or their eventual liberation, depending on how the war went. Never able to look out at the plain without being reminded of the danger waiting at its edge. The river Scamander, called by the Trojans Xanthos, meaning the golden or tawny river, a name that captures something of the color of its water in the summer months when the flow was low, wound through the center of the plain in a series of broad, slow curves. In the mythology of the war, the Scamander was not merely a river, but a divine presence, a god who took active sides in the conflict. At one point in the Iliad, the river god rises in fury against Achilles, filling the river with bodies and churning its banks with something like divine anger. This mythological dimension tells us something about how the Trojans perceived their landscape. The river was not simply a topographical feature, but a living thing, part of the community of divine beings who inhabited the world, and who had interests and preferences, and who could be offended or appeased. But from the wall at night, the river was simpler than its mythology. It was a line of softer darkness moving through the plain, catching light differently from the dry ground on either side of it, its surface picking up the reflections of stars and the distant glow of campfires, and holding them in slow-moving patterns. A sentry watching the plain in the dark hours might follow the curves of the river with his eyes, a natural movement, something to focus on in the absence of more alarming things to watch.
The fires of the Greek encampment would have dominated the view. 1,000 fires, or several hundred, depending on which account you follow. The Iliad at one point describes the Greek watchfires on the night before a major battle as being as numerous as stars, a poetic exaggeration that nonetheless speaks to the genuine impression that a large encampment of fires makes in darkness when viewed from a distance. The fires would have been spread across the beach and the low ground near the ships, clustered more densely where the main camp stood, scattered more loosely at the edges where the outposts were. A careful observer could, over years of watching, have learned to read the patterns of those fires, the way you might learn to read any familiar landscape, to know when the pattern was normal and when something about it had changed. Changes in the fire pattern could mean many things. More fires than usual might mean a larger contingent had arrived, reinforcements from somewhere along the Greek world. Fewer fires might mean a sortie was being prepared, men moved out quietly in the dark. A fire moving along the edge of the camp might be a patrol circuit. A cluster of unusual activity around a particular area of the camp might be a council meeting, or a celebration after a day's fighting, or the preparation of some kind of assault.
The sentries would have watched for all of these things, and they would have watched for movement in the no-man's land between the walls and a camp, the scarred and trampled ground of the plain that had been fought over so many times in 9 years of war that it bore the marks of combat in its very surface, in the old blood and the broken weapons and the shallow graves and the ground that had been churned by chariot wheels and the feet of thousands of men. To the southeast, if a sentry turned from the plain to look inland, the long ridge of Mount Ida rose against the sky, its slopes dark with forest, its upper peaks sometimes cloud-wrapped, even on clear nights. In the mythology of the war, Mount Ida was a divine observation point. The gods of Olympus, taking sides as they did in all human conflicts, but especially in this one, gathered on Ida's heights to watch the fighting below, to intervene when their favorites were threatened, to argue among themselves about the justice and the outcome of the struggle. Zeus sat on Ida and tried to balance the scales of the war. Hera and Athena, supporting the Greeks, watched from nearby and plotted their interventions. Apollo and Aphrodite, favoring the Trojans, watched for their opportunities too. From the walls at night, the Trojan sentry looking toward Ida might have felt, in some corner of his mind, that he was not entirely alone in the darkness, that somewhere above him on those dark slopes, immense and invisible presences watching the same plain, keeping their own version of the watch. Section 7. The Scaean Gate and the weight of names.
Let your breath come slow and even. There is no hurry here. The night is long, and we have all of it. In Troy, names had weight, places had weight. The particular geography of the city, the names of its gates and its towers and its streets, carried the accumulated significance of everything that had happened there, the way that old places always accumulate meaning over time, becoming denser and more resonant the longer they are inhabited and the more lives are lived within them. No place in Troy carried more weight than the Scaean Gate. This was the main western gate of the city, the gate that opened directly toward the plain of battle, the gate through which the Trojan warriors issued each morning to fight, and through which they returned each evening. The gate itself, the physical structure, was a substantial piece of architecture. In the excavated remains at Hisarlik, the gates of the citadel were designed with overlapping wall lines that created protected approaches, channeling anyone entering or leaving into a defined corridor where they could be observed and where the gate could be defended. They were wide enough, Homer tells us, for 2 chariots to pass side by side, a detail that matches what archaeologists have actually found at the site, a gate passage broad enough for the heavy vehicles that Bronze Age warfare and Bronze Age prestige required. But the Scaean Gate in the mythology of the war was so much more than its architecture. It was the place where Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, said goodbye to his wife Andromache and his infant son Astyanax before going out to fight Achilles. One of the most humanly tender scenes in the entire Iliad. A moment of private grief and love embedded in the middle of a poem about public violence and heroic death. Andromache stands at the gate with the baby in her arms, weeping, asking Hector not to go, telling him that if he dies, she will be a widow, and the child will be an orphan, and there will be no one left to protect them. And Hector, in one of the most famous gestures in ancient literature, reaches out toward the child to embrace him, and the baby cries out in fear at the bronze helmet and the horsehair crest nodding above his father's face, not recognizing his own father behind the armor. Hector laughs and removes his helmet, and then embraces his son, and then says his goodbyes, and then goes out through the Scaean Gate to fight. He does not come back. This is the emotional geography of the gate, not merely a door in a wall, but a threshold between life and death, between the warm interior of the city and the cold plain of war, between everything the Trojans loved and everything that threatened to take it from them. Every time a warrior passed through the Scaean Gate, he performed a small act of courage, a willingness to step from safety into danger, from the known world into the world of unpredictable violence.
Every time a sentry stood at the gate in the darkness, checking the barring beams, looking out through the crack between the doors at the dark plain beyond, he was performing the ritual of that threshold, maintaining the line between inside and outside that the gate represented. The old King Priam spent time at this gate. Homer describes him sitting in it during the fighting, watching the battle on the plain below with the terrible helplessness of an aged man who has sent his sons out to fight and can do nothing but watch. Beside him sat the elders of Troy, men too old for combat, men who had lived long enough to know what the city had been before the war, and who sat in the gate's shadow, trying to remember that older Troy, while the sounds of battle drifted up from the plain.
The women of Troy also came to this gate. They came to watch, and they came to grieve, and sometimes they came simply to be as close as they could to the men they loved, without crossing into the dangerous world beyond the wall. Helen herself, the figure at the center of the war's mythological causation, the beautiful Spartan queen whose elopement with the Trojan prince Paris had set the entire conflict in motion, appears in the Iliad on the walls near this gate, watching the Greek and Trojan champions below, identified and naming them for the aged Priam who sits beside her. The scene has a strange, muted quality. The woman whose departure from Sparta supposedly started a decade of war, standing on the walls of the city that sheltered her, describing her former husband's comrades to an old man who regards her without apparent hostility. At night, the gate was secured. Guards stood at the towers on either side of it. The barring beams were in place. The threshold was sealed. But you could still lean over the parapet above it and look out at the plain stretching away into the darkness, and feel the weight of all that the gate contained, all the comings and goings, all the goodbyes, all the moments of courage and fear, all the years of a war that neither side had managed to end. Section 8. A City Under Siege. 10 Years of Waiting. Let your muscles relax a little more. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes not from sudden exertion, but from long endurance, from doing the same hard thing day after day for so long that you can no longer remember exactly what it was like before. This is the tiredness of Troy. The siege of Troy, in Homer's telling, lasted 10 years. 10 years is a span of time that is difficult to hold in the mind as a single coherent thing. It is too long, too various, too full of ordinary days that blur into one another. A child born in Troy at the beginning of the war would by its end be 10 years old enough to remember nothing else, to have grown up inside a besieged city as their entire experience of the world. An old person at the war's beginning might not live to see its end, dying with the siege still in progress, carried out through gates that had been guarded against an enemy for the whole of their final decade of life. What did the inside of that decade feel like?
There would have been periods of intense fighting. The Iliad is set, we are told, in the final year of the war, and even within that single year, it describes days of battle alternating with truces, negotiations, councils, and the ordinary intervals between combat that characterize any prolonged military conflict. But for the people inside the city who were not warriors, The women, the children, the old, the craftsmen and merchants and servants who made up the bulk of the population, the siege would have had a different texture, less defined by the drama of combat than by the grinding attrition of long uncertainty, the daily management of limited resources, the constant background awareness that the enemy was there, just beyond the walls, and had been there for what felt like forever. Food would have been a persistent concern. Troy controlled rich agricultural land on the plain, but that plain was also the battlefield, and farming under siege conditions was a complicated proposition. The lower city contained storage facilities, large clay piphoi, wide-mouthed storage jars, some of them large enough to hold a person, buried partially in the ground to keep their contents cool, and these would have been carefully managed. Rationing is not a word that appears in Homer's poetic account, which tends to describe the Trojans at feast rather than at famine, but the practical logistics of feeding a city of 10,000 people during a decade-long siege would have required careful administration.
Water was probably less of a problem. Troy sat above the valley of the Scamander, and the citadel had access to springs and wells within its walls. The lower city would have had cisterns and water management systems that the archaeology at Hyssardic has partially revealed. But other necessities, metals for weapons, textiles for clothing, wood for fuel and construction, the long chains of trade goods that a Bronze Age city needed to sustain its economic life, would have become progressively harder to obtain as the siege continued. And yet the city continued. Markets still operated. Priests still performed their rites. Smiths still forged bronze. Weavers still worked at their looms. Children still played in the streets of the lower city, and people still fell in love and argued with their neighbors and complained about the price of things and found reasons to laugh, because this is what people do in the middle of even the worst circumstances. They find the ordinary textures of life and hold on to them, because the alternative is despair.
The temples of Troy would have been particularly active during the war years. The Trojans worshipped a version of the divine world that overlapped in many ways with the Greek pantheon, the great gods of the Bronze Age Mediterranean world who appear in Homer under Greek names, but who had Anatolian and Near Eastern equivalents. Apollo was deeply associated with Troy. His oracle at Thymbra, near the city, was an important religious site, and the god is consistently depicted as a protector of the Trojans throughout the Iliad. The goddess Athena also had a sacred image, the Palladium, housed in a temple within the citadel, and the Trojans believed that as long as this image remained in the city, Troy could not fall. Offerings were made, prayers were offered, the rhythms of religious observance that structured everyday life in the ancient world continued regardless of the war outside the walls. Religious festivals would have provided structure to the year, the great annual rituals of sacrifice and feast and prayer that marked the seasons and maintained the community's relationship with the divine. Even under siege, these festivals would have been celebrated, perhaps with more earnest supplication than usual, the prayers for divine protection taking on a particular urgency that ordinary years didn't require. The priests and priestesses of Troy, and among them the figure of Cassandra, Priam's daughter, the prophetess whom no one believed, would have been central figures in the city's spiritual life, their rituals a form of communal reassurance in the face of collective fear. All of this is the city that the sentries were guarding, not an abstraction, not a symbol, a real and living place with real people sleeping in it and dreaming in it and doing their best to go on living even in the middle of a war that showed no sign of ending. Section 9. The Voices of the Night. Hector, Priam, and the People of Troy.
The names of Homer's Trojans are among the most human names in ancient literature. Not the most heroic, not the most glamorous. The Greeks have a stronger claim to heroic glamour, perhaps, with their Achilles and their Odysseus and their Ajax. But the most human, the most caught in the web of ordinary love and ordinary loss that makes literature matter beyond the age that produced it. Let their voices come quietly into this night watch with us.
Priam, king of Troy. He appears in the Iliad as a very old man, old enough to remember a different Troy, old enough to have sons dying in a war he could not have foreseen and cannot now prevent. Homer gives him dignity and sorrow in equal measure. In one of the most remarkable episodes in the Iliad, perhaps in all of ancient literature, Priam goes alone into the Greek camp under the cover of darkness, guided by the god Hermes in disguise, to beg the body of his son Hector from Achilles, who has been dragging it behind his chariot in the dust in his grief-driven rage. The old king kneels before the man who killed his son, takes Achilles' hands in his own, and appeals not to any political calculation, but simply to the shared grief of fathers. Achilles' father is old too, he says, and worries for his son. And perhaps even Achilles can understand what it is to be a father who loves his child. And in that moment, the two enemies, the Greek hero and the Trojan king, weep together for what the war has cost them both. This is not the scene of a king who is primarily a political figure or a military strategist. This is a father, making himself completely vulnerable in the darkness outside an enemy's shelter, doing the one thing left within his power, asking only to take his son's body home to be properly mourned and buried. The image of Priam in the darkness walking into the enemy camp is one of the great images of courage in ancient literature. A different kind of courage from the courage of Achilles or Hector on the battlefield, quieter and in some ways more profound. Queen Hecuba, Priam's wife and Troy's queen, carries a different weight in the mythology of the war. Homer depicts her as a woman of fierce maternal love and equally fierce grief, a woman who has 50 children and who watches them die one by one over the course of the war's 10 years, who tries to prevent Priam from going to Achilles because she cannot believe that Achilles will show mercy, who rages at the gods and at the war and at the futility of everything she cannot prevent. Later accounts of the fall of Troy give her a particularly terrible fate. Enslaved after the city's fall, watching her last children die, ultimately transformed by grief into something beyond human. These later stories are not Homer's, but they speak to the symbolic weight that Hecuba accumulated over centuries of retelling. She became the figure of ultimate maternal loss, the woman who endured more than anyone should have to endure, and was changed by it.
Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, and perhaps the figure in the Iliad who most directly invites the modern reader's identification and sympathy. Where Achilles is extraordinary, almost beyond human, the son of a goddess, burning with a divine ferocity that sets him apart from ordinary experience, Hector is recognizable in a different way. He is brave and skilled, but he is also frightened sometimes and conflicted, and caught between his duty to the city and his love for his wife and son. He knows the war is probably lost. He says so explicitly to Andromache. He tells her that he knows Troy will fall, that he knows what will happen to her and to their son when it does, and that this knowledge does not free him from his obligation to fight, because what else can a man do when his city is under siege and his people are depending on him? There is something in that passage that has spoken to people across 3,000 years of reading, something true about the experience of facing an impossible situation with insufficient resources and choosing to face it anyway, not because you expect to succeed, but because the alternative is abandoning everything you love without a fight.
And then there is Cassandra, the prophetess, the daughter of Priam, who was given the gift of true prophecy by Apollo, and then cursed when she refused his advances, with the affliction that no one would ever believe her. She knew throughout all the years of the war how it would end. She saw the fall of Troy as clearly as she saw the walls around her, as clearly as you see the ceiling above your bed right now. And she could say it aloud, could shout it from the towers if she liked, and no one would believe her, because the curse was not silence, but disbelief, which is in many ways a crueler thing. The Trojans heard her and dismissed her as mad. They brought the wooden horse through the gates while she screamed warnings. They went to bed that night while she watched the horse in the courtyard, and knew. We will come back to that horse, but for now just hold these voices in your mind: the old king and the grieving queen, the doomed hero and the unbelieved prophetess. They are all somewhere in the city below the walls tonight. The sentries above can hear, faintly, the sounds of the city settling toward sleep. These are the people they are keeping watch for. Section 10. The gods above the walls. Divine war on Olympus.
There is something in the way ancient people thought about the divine world that is worth sitting with for a moment before we go further into the night. In the world of Bronze Age Greece and Anatolia, the world that Homer's Iliad reflects, however imperfectly, the gods were not remote and abstract beings who operated according to mysterious cosmic logic. They were intensely present. They had personalities, they had favorites, they argued with each other and changed their minds and intervened in human events with the unapologetic partisanship of people watching a sporting contest they have a personal stake in. This mattered enormously to the way the Trojans understood their situation. The war was not simply a human conflict with divine dimensions. It was, from the Trojan perspective, a war in which the gods themselves were divided, in which Olympus was a second battlefield, whose outcome would directly determine the outcome of the one on the plain below. And the Trojans, watching the skies and reading omens and performing their daily rituals of sacrifice and prayer, were trying at every moment to discern which way the divine wind was blowing.
The divine factions in the Iliad are well established. On the Greek side, Hera, queen of the gods, who had a personal grievance against Troy dating to the judgment of Paris, the mythological beauty contest in which the Trojan prince Paris had chosen Aphrodite over Hera and Athena, awarding the golden apple to Aphrodite in exchange for the promise of the most beautiful woman in the world. Hera never forgave this slight, and her interventions in the war are motivated by an implacable divine resentment that not even Zeus can fully override. Athena, similarly spurned at the judgment, sided with the Greeks with a cold intellectual ferocity. She appeared directly on the battlefield, protected Greek champions, and once lured the Trojan archer Pandarus into firing an arrow that broke a truce and reignited a battle that had briefly been moving toward peace. On the Trojan side, Apollo,
the archer god, the god of prophecy and light and many other things, who had a long-standing connection with Troy and who intervened repeatedly on behalf of its defenders, sending plague among the Greeks, deflecting weapons, protecting wounded Trojan heroes. Aphrodite, bound by her promise to Paris, who had given him Helen, intervened to protect Paris himself when he was in danger, whisking him off the battlefield in a cloud when Menelaus was about to kill him. Ares, the god of war, favored the Trojans at times, though his association with violence was so undiscriminating that both sides had reason to fear him.
And over all of it, Zeus, trying to maintain some cosmic balance, trying to honor the fates, but also susceptible to persuasion, to the particular domestic pressure of Hera's arguments, to moments of sympathy for individuals on both sides. Zeus is the most complicated divine figure in the Iliad, because he is both the guarantor of the cosmic order that will eventually bring Troy down, and simultaneously a father figure who grieves over the deaths the war requires. For the Trojans standing on the walls at night, this divine dimension was not metaphorical. The gods were real and present. The omens were real, a flight of birds seen at dawn, the behavior of the animals brought for sacrifice, the pattern of smoke from an altar fire, the dreams that came in the night, and that the priests and seers interpreted with practiced attention. A sentry on the walls might see a falling star and feel in his gut that it was a message from somewhere beyond the human, and he might spend the rest of his watch wondering what it meant, whether it was auspicious or ominous, whether the gods of Olympus were watching him specifically, or whether the divine attention was focused elsewhere tonight.
The priests and the religious specialists of Troy would have been busy throughout the war years, performing the rituals of propitiation and supplication that were the Trojans' primary means of influencing the divine world. Hecatombs, large sacrifices of many animals, were offered at moments of particular crisis or before major battles, the blood and smoke of the sacrifice rising towards Olympus as a kind of communication, an appeal to divine attention. The great temple within the citadel, with its sacred image of Athena, would have been a center of this activity. Other shrines and altars were positioned throughout the city and beyond its walls.
This is the hour when the world is most quiet and most strange, when the difference between waking and sleeping begins to blur at the edges, when the mind produces thoughts that have a particular color, neither quite the logic of the day nor the narrative of dreams, but something in between, something that belongs to the small hours specifically, and cannot quite be reproduced at any other time. The sentry on the wall of Troy knows this hour. He has known it on many walls, in many weathers, across the years of a life spent in service. By the time of the war's 10th year, the men who had been assigned to the night watch had spent so many nights in this position that the watch itself had become a kind of second nature, a set of reflexes and rhythms so ingrained that they operated with minimal conscious effort, freeing the mind to go wherever it wanted to go in the long dark hours between midnight and the first light of dawn. Let us walk with him now.
The torch at the northeastern bastion is burning steadily, throwing a warm circle of light on the stone floor of the tower top and leaving everything beyond it in deep darkness. The sentry's shadow moves huge and soft against the inner face of the wall as he paces. He has been doing this for 2 hours now, the same circuit, the same slow walk from the tower's edge to its far corner and back, pausing to look out over the parapet at regular intervals, listening, reading the darkness with attention that is automatic now, that doesn't require much deliberate effort.
The plain is quiet tonight. This is not always true. There have been nights when things moved in the darkness below the walls, when patrols from the Greek camp probed toward the city, when the watch had to be alert and active. But tonight the plain is still, and the Greek fires are burning in their normal pattern, and there is nothing to see that should not be seen. He looks at the fires for a while. The habit of counting them has never quite left him, even though he knows there is no reliable military intelligence to extract from the count anymore. After 9 years, both sides know each other too well for the number of watchfires to mean much. But he counts anyway. Something in him needs to feel that he is actively gathering information rather than merely standing in the cold and waiting for something to happen. The stars overhead are extraordinary tonight. Clear sky, no cloud, and the Milky Way is a broad, pale swath running from horizon to horizon, its individual stars too numerous and too close together to distinguish at its center. He knows the major patterns, the ones the sailors use, the ones that track the seasons. The Pleiades are low in the west now, and their position tells him something about the time of night and the season and where the year is sitting. The brightest stars are sharp and steady, not twinkling, which means the air is dry and clear and will likely stay that way until morning.
His feet ache on the stone. He shifts his weight, bends slightly, straightens again. Somewhere in the city below, a dog barks twice and then stops. Nothing else responds. The sound is absorbed into the quiet, like a stone into still water, spreading briefly and then gone. He thinks about his family, his wife, his children. They are in the lower city, in a house 2 streets back from the main road, behind the shrine of Apollo that marks the corner of their neighborhood. He has been on the wall for 4 hours now. They are asleep. His youngest child, a daughter, 3 years old at the start of the war, now 12, is probably sprawled in the way she sleeps, one arm thrown wide, mouth slightly open, the sheet kicked half off. He knows this because he has watched her sleep on the nights he is home. Watched her with the particular attention of a parent who is sometimes away, and who therefore doesn't take the ordinary sight of a sleeping child for granted. The thought is both warm and painful. He brings himself back to the wall, back to the plain, back to the watch.
The hour deepens. The fires of the Greek camp burn lower as the night wears on, their fuel consumed. And by the deepest part of the night they are smaller and more scattered, individual points of orange in the darkness, rather than the broad, glowing mass they had been at the start of the evening. The Greek sentries, too, are on their walls, or rather their ditch, the defense they dug around their camp to protect the ships and the men sleeping behind them. He has sometimes wondered about those men, his counterparts across the plain, whether they are cold tonight, whether they are bored, whether they think about their families too. The hour deepens.
The fires of the Greek camp burn lower as the night wears on, their fuel consumed. And by the deepest part of the night, they are smaller and more scattered, individual points of orange in the darkness, rather than the broad, glowing mass they had been at the start of the evening. The Greek sentries, too, are on their walls, or rather their ditch, the defence they dug around their camp to protect the ships and the men sleeping behind them. He has sometimes wondered about those men, his counterparts across the plain, whether they are cold tonight, whether they are bored, whether they think about their families too. The watch officer comes by on his circuit. A brief exchange, the ritual of the check. Nothing to report. Continue watch. The officer moves on to the next post, his footsteps fading around the curve of the wall, and the sentry is alone again. The eastern sky begins, almost imperceptibly at first, to lighten. It is not dawn yet, not for another hour, perhaps two, but the absolute darkness of the middle night is giving way to something slightly less total, a quality of dark that has possibility in it, rather than the sealed and final dark of midnight. The stars near the eastern horizon are beginning to lose their clarity, absorbed into the brightening gradient of the approaching day. He is still on watch. One more hour, perhaps slightly more, and then the relief will come. His feet really ache now. His back is stiff. His eyes are tired in the way that comes not from sleepiness, but from long concentration, from the sustained effort of staring into darkness and trying to see what the darkness contains.
But he keeps looking, he keeps listening, because this is the hour when things happen, the hour just before dawn, when the darkness is still deep enough to conceal movement, but the night is old enough that guards may be less alert, when the dreams of sleeping men are most vivid and their walls are thinnest. This is when the Greeks, if they were going to do something, might choose to do it. They don't tonight. The plain stays still, the sky continues to lighten, and when the relief finally comes, padding up the stone stairs with the self-contained quiet of men who know to move carefully in the dark, the sentry relinquishes his post with something between relief and reluctance, the complicated feeling of a man who has done his job for another night and is not yet sure whether that is enough. Section 12. Fire across the water. The Greek camp at night. The Greek camp in the Iliad is a city in its own right, a temporary, violent, restless city of ships and tents and men, strung out along a beach for 9 years. The army that Homer describes was drawn from across the Greek world. Men from Mycenae, from Argos, from Sparta, from Pylos, from Crete, from the islands, from Thessaly and Aetolia, and a dozen other places, each contingent nominally under its own king or commander, but all loosely bound together under the overall command of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, whose authority was real but contested, powerful but fragile. The ships were drawn up on the beach, hull to hull, masts unstepped and stored, their black-painted sides serving as partial shelter and as the organizational structure around which the camp was arranged.
Each contingent's ships were grouped together, the men of each region camping near their own vessels, giving the camp a loose but persistent internal geography that persisted through the years. The Myrmidons under Achilles were at one end of the line, the Salaminians under Ajax were at the other. The ships and tents of Odysseus and Diomedes and Menelaus and all the other Greek commanders were arranged between them.
Around the camp ran the defensive trench that the Greeks dug, the moat and palisade that appear prominently in the Iliad's fighting, protecting the ships from Trojan sorties and giving the camp a defined boundary, a perimeter that the watchfires marked at night. A sentry on the walls of Troy, looking down at the Greek camp in the darkness, would have seen these fires most clearly at the camp's edges, where the watchposts were established, and a more diffuse glow from within the camp's interior, where men cooked their suppers and sat around fires telling stories and doing the 1,000 small things that armies do in the evenings between days of fighting. What were those stories? We can only speculate. They would have been the things that soldiers have always talked about around fires: home, family, food, complaints about the commanders, speculation about the war's end, memories of previous fights, the particular dark humor that people who live close to death develop as a way of managing it. The heroes of the Iliad, Achilles, Ajax, Diomedes, were extraordinary men, whose extraordinary deeds are what Homer chose to record. But around them, in the camp on the beach, were thousands of ordinary men who left no individual record, who are remembered only as the collective body of the Greek army, who cooked their meals and mended their equipment, and wrote their names in the sand for luck, and wondered every night whether they would still be alive when the war finally ended.
From the walls of Troy, these men were enemies, abstract, collective, threatening. The Trojan sentries had fought against them on the plain, had watched them advance in their formations, had felt the weight of their assault against the gates and the walls. But they had also watched them for 9 years in the evenings from the walls, and over that time the enemy had become, in some strange way, familiar. Not known, not individual, but familiar, in the way that a landscape becomes familiar when you have looked at it long enough. The rhythm of the Greek camp at night, the flaring of the fires as fresh wood was added, the diminishing as the night went on, the particular clustering of activity around certain central points, the way the sound of men and horses and metal carried differently on still nights than on windy ones, all of this had been absorbed over 9 years into the Trojan sentries' understanding of what the night normally contained. This familiarity was both practical and, in a way that is hard to articulate, humanizing. Not that the Trojans stopped fighting the Greeks, not that they wanted the enemy gone any less desperately than they had at the beginning of the war, but perhaps after 9 years of watching those fires from the walls, it became difficult to see them as purely abstract. Difficult not to think of the men behind the fires as men, even if they were enemy men, even if their presence was the source of everything that was wrong with the world right now.
The Greek camp had its own religious rituals that the Trojans would have been aware of even if they could not see them directly. The great sacrifices before battles were sometimes dramatic enough to be visible at a distance, the fires large, the ceremony extended. Apollo's anger with the Greeks early in the Iliad manifests as a plague, described as beginning with the animals and then spreading to the men. And the Trojans watching from the walls would have noticed changes in the camp's activity patterns, even if they didn't know the specific cause. A quieter camp,
fewer fires, a different distribution of movement. These were things an attentive observer could read. And then, in the final days of the war, something extraordinary happened. The fires were not there. Section 13. The Horse That Was Not Yet Built. The Final Nights. We are coming toward the end of the story now. Not the end of the night. The night is still around you, still soft and dark and generous, but the end of the city's long watch. The end of the 10 years. The end that Cassandra had always known was coming. Let it come slowly. There is no urgency in the telling.
The construction of the wooden horse was, in its way, one of the most brilliantly simple military deceptions in recorded history. Simple not in its execution, building a hollow wooden structure large enough to conceal a significant number of armed men, doing it quickly and in a way that would withstand close inspection, required considerable skill and organization. But in its concept, the entire plan depended on the Trojans being willing to do one thing: bring the horse inside the walls. And the plan worked because it understood human psychology as well as military tactics. It gave the Trojans something they desperately wanted to believe: that the war was over, that the Greeks had given up and gone home, that the 10-year ordeal had finally ended, and then asked only that they take one simple action to confirm that belief. The Greek army, when they departed, left the horse on the beach near the gates of Troy. They burned their camp and sailed away across the water to the island of Tenedos, where they dropped anchor and waited out of sight. A single Greek, Sinon, was left behind, captured or appearing to be captured by the Trojans, with a carefully prepared false story about why he had been left behind by his own people and why the horse had been built and what it meant. Homer doesn't describe the construction of the horse in the Iliad itself. The poem ends before that event, with Hector's funeral rites. The horse episode comes from later sources, from the Odyssey's brief references, and from the fuller account in the Aeneid and the later epic cycle. But its outlines are clear enough.
The horse was enormous. It had to be large enough to conceal somewhere between 20 and 40 armed men. Accounts vary on the exact number, with estimates ranging from a handful of elite warriors to several dozen. It was built of fir wood, according to some accounts, constructed in the manner of a ship's hull, which makes sense given that the Greeks had a workforce of skilled shipbuilders available to them on the beach. The hollow interior was accessible through some kind of trapdoor or removable panel in the belly, and the outside was fashioned into the shape of a horse, the sacred animal of Poseidon, god of earthquakes and sea, the divine patron of the Greeks. The inscription on the horse's side, in some versions, declared it an offering to Athena, a votive gift left to ensure the Greeks' safe voyage home. This detail was crucial to the deception, because Athena was also worshipped in Troy, and a sacred gift to Athena left outside the city's walls created an uncomfortable theological dilemma. To destroy it would be to risk the goddess's wrath, but to leave it outside was to abandon a sacred object to the elements. The morning the Trojans woke to find the Greek camp burned and abandoned and the fleet gone from the harbor was a morning unlike any other in the 9 years of the war. The sentries on the walls, making their dawn check of the plain, saw the empty beach and the abandoned camp, and probably stood there for a long moment in disbelief before they started shouting. After 9 years, it was over. The Greeks had gone.
The gates of Troy opened. People poured out onto the plain, the first time in years that the population could move freely outside the walls. going to look at the ruins of the camp, picking through the remains, finding the horse on the beach. And the arguments began. Cassandra saw exactly what the horse was and screamed it. The priest Laocoon threw a spear at the horse's side and warned the Trojans not to trust the Greeks even bearing gifts. But Sinon's story was persuasive, and the desire to believe the war was over was overwhelming, and the theological concerns about destroying Athena's offering carried weight with the priests. The horse was brought through the Scaean gate, through the gate that Hector had walked out of on his last morning, through the gate that Andromache had stood at weeping. The horse went through, and the gates were closed behind it, and Troy celebrated, feasted, drank, made offerings to the gods in thanks for their deliverance, and finally went to sleep. The sentries who came on watch that night walked their posts in a city that was celebrating. The fires they saw in the Greek camp were the fires of a burned and abandoned encampment, not the fires of an active army. The plain was empty, the beach was empty. The watch was perhaps the most relaxed watch in 9 years, because for the first time in 9 years there was no enemy to watch for. Some accounts suggest that the sentries were drinking or sleeping or simply less rigorous than they might otherwise have been, which, under the circumstances, is entirely understandable.
And in the belly of the horse, in the darkness of its hollow interior, a group of Greek warriors lay perfectly still and listened to the city celebrating around them and waited. Sinon gave the signal at midnight, lighting a fire that the fleet at Tenedos could see, calling the ships back to the dark coast. The trapdoor opened, the men descended. They moved through the sleeping city. They opened the Scaean gate from the inside, and the army that had waited 9 years on the beach came through the gate and into the city while its people slept. Cassandra had known. She had always known, and now everyone would know. The last watch on the walls of Troy was the night the watch failed. Not because the sentries were incompetent or cowardly or lazy, because the deception was perfect, and the desire to believe in peace was stronger than the habit of suspicion. Because 10 years is a very long time to be afraid, and the sight of empty beach must have felt like release, and release dulls the vigilance that fear had maintained. The sentries on the walls that night are the last ones. After them, there are no more walls to guard. Section 14. The Walls Remember. Troy after Troy. And now the story settles, slowly, into the longer perspective, the perspective of stone and time.
Troy fell, and then Troy was rebuilt. The people who survived the sack of the city, and some did survive, fleeing into the surrounding countryside, scattering in the chaos of the night, or who returned to the ruins afterward, found a hill that had been inhabited for thousands of years before the Greeks came, and thousands of years before Priam was king, and they built again. Not the great Troy 6 with its splendid limestone walls, not the Troy of the Iliad, but a smaller and humbler settlement that archaeologists call Troy 7b, gradually giving way to other occupations, other layers, other stories. The Greeks came and went, and other empires rose. The Persians knew the site. Alexander the Great visited it in 334 BCE at the very beginning of his campaign against Persia,
stopping at the ruins to honor the Trojan dead and to sacrifice at the tomb of Achilles, whom he regarded as his ancestor, or at least his ideal. He received this site with genuine reverence, understanding the symbolic weight of standing at the place where the Greek and Trojan worlds had met in their defining confrontation. Alexander went on to conquer much of the known world, but he always remembered Troy.
The Romans came later and claimed descent from the survivors of Troy, specifically from Aeneas, a Trojan prince who appears in the Iliad, and whose flight from the burning city became, in the Roman poet Virgil's retelling, the foundation myth of Rome itself. The idea that Rome was built by the survivors of Troy gave the site a renewed sacred importance for the Romans, and several Roman emperors visited and made donations to the temple that stood on the ruins. Julius Caesar is said to have visited. Augustus built. Constantine apparently considered making the site his imperial capital before choosing Byzantium instead. Then the site fell quiet. The trade routes shifted. The Dardanelles still carried ships, but the city on the hill was no longer important. The ruins were gradually swallowed by the landscape, covered by centuries of wind-blown soil, grown over by scrub and grass, until the hill of Hisarlik presented a surface that gave almost no hint of what lay beneath it. Heinrich Schliemann came in the 1870s, burning with the conviction of a man who had read Homer as a child and never stopped believing that the stories were true, and he began to dig. His methods were rough by modern standards. He cut through layers that later archaeologists would give anything to have back intact. But his instinct was correct. There was a city here, many cities, one above the other, and one of them was Troy.
The excavations that have continued at Hisarlik through the 20th and into the 21st century have gradually built up a picture of the site that is more nuanced and more extraordinary than Schliemann could have imagined. The discovery of the lower city in the late 1980s transformed the understanding of the site's scale. Suddenly, the Troy that had seemed too small to be Homer's grand city had a lower town of 30 hectares with its own residential districts and workshops and streets, and the population estimates could be revised upward into a range that made sense for the city Homer described. The walls are still there, partially. Some sections of the Troy 6 citadel walls still stand to several meters in height, the limestone ashlar blocks weathered and worn, but still articulate, still speaking their ancient language of careful construction and defensive intent. The great northeastern bastion is recognizable. The gate passages can be walked through, the stone underfoot worn smooth by generations of feet that no longer exist. The paved stone ramps leading up to the citadel gates are still there, the same stone that Bronze Age feet walked up 3,000 years ago. When archaeologists excavated these walls and this site, they found the ordinary traces of the lives that had been lived here. Pottery sherds by the thousands, fragments of bronze tools and weapons, animal bones from the meals of long-dead people, the murex shells of the purple dye industry, the storage jars, the grinding stones, the small personal objects that people drop and lose, and that the earth preserves with complete democratic impartiality, keeping the king's treasure and the weaver's spindle whorl with equal care.
They found evidence of burning in the Troy 7A layer, fire damage consistent with the destruction of the city, dating to approximately 1180 BCE, roughly the period that ancient sources assign to the fall of Troy. Whether this fire was set by invaders or was accidental, whether it represents the war of the Iliad or some other conflict, is something that archaeology alone cannot determine. But the fire happened. The city burned.
The site today is administered by the Turkish government and is listed by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, recognized not only for its archaeological significance, but for what it represents in terms of cultural memory. The place where one of the foundational stories of Western civilization may have been lived, where the imagination of a poet and the reality of a Bronze Age city met and generated something that has lasted 3,000 years. Visitors to Hisarlik today walk paths through the ruins, reading information boards that contextualize the layers of occupation, looking at the preserved sections of walls that rise above the surrounding landscape, standing at the edge of the site and looking out across what remains of the Trojan plain toward the Dardanelles. The view has changed enormously. The coastline is kilometers further out than it was in the Bronze Age, the landscape reshaped by millennia of sedimentation and cultivation. But the basic geography is the same. The hill is the same hill. The wind comes off the water in the same direction. And on clear evenings, the sky over the plain turns the same colors it has always turned, amber and rose and deep indigo, as the day gives way to night.
Standing there in the dusk, you can almost feel it. The weight of the place pressing upward through the soles of your feet from the compressed centuries below. The sense of standing on a very dense kind of past, a past that has been layered and reinterpreted and told and retold until the stones and the stories have become inseparable from each other. The walls remember. That is the most accurate way to put it. The walls remember being built and being defended and being destroyed and being rebuilt and being abandoned and being excavated and being partially reconstructed, and now being visited by a steady stream of people who come from all over the world to stand in a place that a poem made famous and that archaeology has made real. And somewhere in the long memory of those stones, somewhere in the deep record of what happened here, the sentries are still walking their posts, still pausing at the northeastern bastion to look out at the plain, still counting the fires in the darkness, still listening to the night sounds that the plain produces, the wind through the grass, the river moving over its stones, the distant and endless sound of the sea, still keeping watch over a city that trusted them with its safety, still honoring the obligation of the watch with the quiet attention that the obligation deserves.
They kept watch for 10 years. They kept it faithfully, most of them, most of the time, through cold and exhaustion and the grinding familiarity of a view they had seen too many times. And if the watch ultimately failed, it failed not because of any lack of diligence on the part of the ordinary sentries who walked the ordinary rounds, but because of a deception so perfectly crafted that no amount of vigilance could have defended against it. The war was not lost on the walls, it was lost at the gate, when the Trojans' hope overwhelmed their caution, and they brought the horse through the door. But that is the end of the story, and we have been living in the middle of it tonight, in the long hours of the watch before the end, in the ordinary and extraordinary nights that preceded the final one. Those nights were real. The sentries were real, or as real as anything that lives only in memory and stone and the resonance of a 3,000-year-old poem can be. And they are here with us tonight, those sentries, in this quiet hour of your night as well as theirs. They are walking the rampart, pausing at the parapet,
looking out at the dark plain with tired and patient eyes. The stars are wheeling overhead. The fires are burning where they should be. Everything is as it should be, for now, for this hour, for this watch. The stone is cold, the torch is warm, the city is sleeping below.
Rest now. Let Troy rest. Let the plain stretch out in all its dark and starlit distance. Let the river wind its slow curves toward the sea. Let the fires of the Greek camp burn low and lower and finally out. Let the night take everything gently, the way night does, into its keeping. You are very comfortable. You are very safe. There are walls around you and a roof above you, and the darkness is the soft, good darkness of a room that has grown quiet for the night. The sentries are at their posts. The city is held. The watch continues, as it always has, as it always will, in the long memory that stone and story keep between them. Sleep now. The watch is kept, the walls stand, the night holds everything it holds, and the stars move slowly in their ancient patterns overhead, and the world is very old and very quiet, and you are part of its quietness now, drifting down through the warm, dark layers of a sleep that has been waiting for you all this time, patient and fast and complete. Good night. Section 15. The Language of Stone. How the walls were built and what they said.
Before we let the night fully take us, there is one more thing worth knowing, one more layer to add to your understanding of this place. Because the walls of Troy were not simply barriers, they were a statement. They were a form of communication directed at everyone who approached them. Whether they were merchants arriving by sea hoping to trade, diplomats arriving by road from the Hittite interior, or enemies massing on the plain below. The walls said something, and what they said was designed to be understood instantly and completely by anyone who looked at them. The language of walls in the Bronze Age was a sophisticated one. Every civilization that built serious fortifications understood that the wall's job was not only to physically prevent entry, but to prevent the attempt. A wall that looked too difficult to breach was a wall that never had to prove whether it actually was. The investment in high-quality stonework, in carefully fitted ashlar blocks, in massive towers and deeply battered bases was not merely practical, it was rhetorical. It was the city saying, "We have the resources, the skill, the organization, and the intention to build something that will outlast your patience." The specific technique of the Troy 6 walls deserves a little more attention than we have given it, because it reveals something about how the people who built it thought about both engineering and aesthetics. The ashlar blocks, limestone cut into regular rectangular shapes and fitted together without mortar, relying on precision of cut and careful placement to hold their positions, were quarried from the surrounding landscape and transported to the site. The care with which they were shaped and placed speaks to a tradition of skilled masonry that had been refined over the centuries of Troy's existence. Earlier phases of the city's walls had been cruder in their construction, relying more heavily on rubble cores and less careful surface finishing.
By the Troy 6 phase, the technique had been refined to something that contemporary observers from the Aegean world or the Hittite interior would have recognized as impressive, even by the standards of their own impressive building traditions. The battered exterior, that outward slope of the wall's base, was not merely decorative. It served several practical purposes simultaneously. The slope made it harder for an attacker to place a ladder or a siege engine directly against the wall, because the lower surface angle deflected the base of the ladder outward. It made the wall more stable structurally, distributing the weight of the upper courses more broadly and reducing the tendency of the foundation stones to shift under load. And it made the wall more resistant to undermining, the ancient technique of digging under a wall to collapse it, because the sloped base meant that any tunnel dug toward the foundation had to travel further inward before reaching the critical structural zone.
The towers, projecting outward from the main wall line at intervals, gave the defenders an enfilading capability, the ability to shoot or throw at attackers who were close to the main wall from a position to the side of them, catching them in a crossfire that the tower's angles made possible. This is a principle that appears in fortifications across the ancient world, and that represents one of the genuine intellectual achievements of early military architecture: the understanding that a straight wall has a fatal blind zone immediately adjacent to it, into which defenders cannot easily direct fire, and that towers eliminate this blind zone by extending the defender's reach laterally. The gates, as we have already visited, were designed with the same combination of practical effectiveness and imposing statement. The overlapping wall lines that created the protected approach corridors. The visitor had to pass between two sections of wall that slightly overlapped each other, creating a channeled entry point where they were exposed to defenders on both sides, were a design solution that recurs independently in many cultures across the Bronze Age and Iron Age world. It represents an understanding of how attackers move and how to control the geometry of their approach. The gate was the weakest point of any wall, the obvious target of any assault, and the designers of Troy's gates had clearly thought carefully about how to make that weakness as small as possible.
But there was also something about the gates that was open and generous, particularly in peacetime. The wide gate passages, the main gate was, as Homer described it, and as the archaeology confirms, broad enough for 2 chariots to pass abreast, spoke of a city that was not merely a fortress, but a functioning center of trade and movement. Narrow gates are for cities that primarily fear their neighbors. Wide gates are for cities that primarily serve as hubs, that expect constant traffic and want that traffic to flow freely. Troy was both a fortress and a hub, and its gates embodied both identities simultaneously. The interior of the citadel, accessible through these gates, was organized along the rising terraces of the hill in a way that reinforced the social hierarchy of the city. The higher you lived within the citadel, the closer you were to the palace at its summit, and the higher your social status. The free-standing houses on the outer terraces, large, stone-built, multi-story structures with carefully dressed exterior walls, belonged to the Trojan elite, the nobles and the wealthy merchants, and the senior military and administrative figures whose status entitled them to residence within the citadel walls. Below them, in the lower city outside the citadel, lived everyone else. This spatial organization of status was common across the Bronze Age world and would have been immediately legible to any visitor. You looked at the city and knew, without needing to be told, how it was organized and who mattered within it. The palace at the top was invisible from the plain below, screened by the walls and the lower buildings,
but its existence could be inferred from the quality and organization of what was visible. A city that builds like this, the walls announced, has a king at its center, resources at its disposal, and the will to defend both. What the walls could not say, what no walls can ever say, was how long the thing they protected would last. The limestone blocks were cut with the expectation of permanence. The artisans who shaped them and fitted them and set them in their courses were building, they believed, something that would stand as long as the hill beneath it. And in a sense, they were right. The walls did stand. The foundations are still there. You can still walk beside them today. But the city they enclosed did not last forever. The civilization that built them has been gone for more than 3,000 years. The walls outlasted the people who built them, as walls always do, as stone always outlasts the flesh that chose and shaped and set it.
Standing at the base of those remaining stones at Hisarlik today, looking up at their weathered faces, you feel this paradox pressing in. The wall was meant to protect the people. The wall survived. The people are gone. Was the wall a success or a failure? This is perhaps not a question that has a useful answer. The walls were built by human hands for human purposes, and they served those purposes as well as anything built by human hands can serve its purposes, imperfectly, temporarily, magnificently. That they still stand at all, in any form, in any fragment, is its own kind of miracle, its own testament to the patience of stone. The sentries who walked along the top of these walls, whose boots wore the surface of the rampart walk smooth over the years, are long gone. Their names are not recorded, their thoughts are not preserved. But the wall they walked is still there, still marking the edge between the place where the city was and the place where the enemy waited, still holding the line in its way across the enormous distance of time. Section 16. The Long Echo, Troy in Memory and Dream. There is a kind of place that exists not only in geography, but in the imagination of an entire civilization, a place so deeply embedded in the stories a culture tells about itself that it becomes part of the mental furniture of anyone raised within that culture's reach. Troy is one of those places, perhaps the oldest and most persistent of them in the Western tradition.
Consider the reach of it. Homer composed the Iliad, or compiled it, or gave final shape to a tradition that had been accumulating for centuries before him, in approximately the 8th century BCE. That was roughly 3,000 years ago. In the intervening time, the story of Troy has been retold in every medium available to each successive generation, in epic poetry, in tragedy, in lyric verse, in philosophical dialogue, in Latin epic, in medieval romance, in Renaissance drama, in neoclassical opera, in the novel, in cinema, in graphic novels, in video games. Each retelling carries something forward from the ones before it and adds something of its own, and the result is a story that has been in continuous cultural circulation for so long that it has become part of the background radiation of Western thought, something that is simply there, absorbed into the culture at such a deep level that many people who have never read Homer still know what the Trojan horse is, still understand the idiom of the Greek gift, still feel something when they hear the name of Achilles or Helen or Hector.
What accounts for this extraordinary persistence? Partly, certainly, it is the literary quality of Homer's original. The Iliad is simply one of the greatest works of narrative art ever produced, a poem that achieves things no other ancient text quite achieves, in terms of the depth and complexity of its human characterizations, the quality of its attention to both the grandeur and the squalor of war, the precision with which it renders physical experience and emotional truth simultaneously. But the Iliad's literary quality, remarkable as it is, cannot fully explain the cultural grip of the Troy story. Many works of comparable quality have not achieved the same kind of persistent centrality. Part of the explanation lies in what the Troy story is about at its deepest level. Not the siege, not the horse, not the fall of the city, but the things that these events are vehicles for. The story of Troy is, at its heart, a story about the relationship between individual excellence and collective destruction. It is a story about what happens when a civilization's greatest individuals are deployed in service of its greatest folly. Achilles is the best fighter in the world, and his participation in the war achieves almost nothing permanent. His victories on the battlefield are tactical and temporary. His personal glory purchased at an enormous and ultimately meaningless cost. The city he helps destroy replaced by others and remembered in stories rather than lived in. Hector is the best man in Troy, brave, loyal, loving, morally serious, and he is killed, and his city falls anyway, and his greatness turns out to have been insufficient to the scale of the catastrophe confronting him. This is a story that speaks to something real about human experience, about the gap between individual virtue and collective fate, between what one person can do and what history will do regardless. The Troy story is also about the terrible efficiency of grief. The Iliad is saturated with mourning, mourning for Patroclus, mourning for Hector, mourning for the city that is coming, mourning for the Greek soldiers who will never go home. Homer does not present grief as something that can be worked through and left behind. He presents it as something that accumulates, that weights the living with the continuing presence of the dead, that reshapes the people it visits into something different from what they were before. Achilles, after Patroclus dies, is not the same person he was before. He is grief-made, grief-driven, grief-blinded, and no amount of victory on the battlefield can address what he has lost. This picture of grief as a transforming rather than merely transitory experience is one that readers across 3,000 years have recognized in their own lives. And then there is the theme that connects most directly to our night on the walls, the theme of endurance. The city of Troy endures for 10 years against a force that should, by any rational calculation, have overwhelmed it quickly. The Trojans endure not because they are winning, not because they are confident of victory, but because they have nowhere else to go, because the city is what they are, and to surrender it is to cease to be themselves. This kind of endurance, the endurance not of the person who believes they will win, but of the person who simply refuses to stop, is one of the most deeply human things the story contains, and it is one of the reasons that the Trojan side of the war, despite being the losing side, has so often attracted more sympathy than the Greek side in subsequent retellings. When Virgil, writing in the 1st century BCE, wanted to explain the origins of Rome to the Roman people, he reached back to Troy and made the Roman ancestor Aeneas a Trojan survivor,
a man who carried the household gods of Troy out of the burning city on his back and spent years wandering the Mediterranean in search of a new home where those gods could be re-established and the city could, in a transformed way, continue. The Romans were in a sense claiming to be the Troy that did not die, the Troy that carried its essence forward into a new form in a new place. This is an extraordinary act of cultural memory, a great empire reaching back across nearly 1,000 years to claim descent from a destroyed city, to say, we are the continuation of that story, we are what Troy became. Medieval Europe, with limited direct access to Homer, but considerable access to Latin summaries and retellings, constructed its own versions of the Troy story that emphasized different aspects: the courtly love elements, the betrayal themes, the fate of individual heroes. Medieval Troy was a place of elaborate courts and complex honor codes, refracted through the lens of chivalric culture. Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, written in the early 17th century, took the story in yet another direction, darker, more ironic, more suspicious of the heroic postures that the characters strike for each other's benefit, more interested in the gap between what the heroes say about themselves and what they actually do. Every age has found in Troy a mirror for its own preoccupations, its own anxieties, its own questions about war and heroism and the cost of glory.
What will the ages after ours find there? We cannot know. But we can know that the story will continue to be told, because it is one of those stories that human beings seem to need. Not because it provides comfort or resolution. It provides neither, really. Troy falls, the survivors scatter, the grief is not resolved. But because it provides recognition. It shows people something true about the experience of being mortal and trying to make things that matter and losing them in the end. It shows people something true about the relationship between beauty and destruction, between love and war, between the private world of individual feeling and the public world of collective catastrophe. The stone has been here all along, waiting in the way that stone waits, patient beyond any human patience, holding its place on the hillside while everything around it has changed beyond recognition, while the sea retreated and the river changed its course, and the empires rose and fell, and the languages died and were replaced by other languages, and the very stars above have shifted slightly in their positions since the Bronze Age centuries watched them. The stone remembers, the story remembers, and on nights like this one, quiet nights, dark nights, nights when the world outside your window has grown still, and the distance between you and the ancient world seems briefly navigable, the two kinds of memory meet, somewhere in the space between telling and listening, between the past that was and the present that is, and something passes through that space that is neither history nor myth, but a little of both. You are lying in your bed. The walls of your room are around you, keeping the dark outside where it belongs. Whatever city you are in, whatever country, whatever century,
You are inside your own walls, in your own small citadel, in the warm and sheltered interior that is yours. And somewhere in the long, long chain of human experience that connects you to those Bronze Age sentries on their wind-cold ramparts, you share something with them that has no name, but that you would recognize it if you felt it. The particular peace of being inside when the night is outside, of being held within walls while the world goes about its vast and uncontrollable business beyond them.
The sentries kept their watch so that you, or someone like you, in some form, in some future they could not have imagined, could sleep inside without fear. That is what walls are for, finally. Not to imprison, but to protect. Not to exclude the world, but to give those inside a space in which to rest, to dream, to gather themselves against the morning. The morning will come, it always does, but it is not yet, and between now and then there is only the soft and generous dark, and the slow revolution of the stars, and the murmur of an old story telling itself in the back of your mind, as you drift, finally, toward the place where stories and sleep become indistinguishable from each other. The watch is kept, the night holds, the walls stand, and you are safe inside them. Let go now. Let the last of the waking world release you. The sentries have their eyes on the plain, the torches are burning. The city is breathing around you in the dark. 10,000 sleeping souls, and the guards above them walking their slow and faithful rounds, and the stars above the guards doing what stars have always done, which is to shine without rest and without purpose, and without any awareness of being watched, and to be beautiful anyway. Drift down. Let the warmth of your bed be the warmth of a city that is for now safe. Let the darkness be the darkness between the stars over the Trojan plain, enormous, indifferent, and oddly comforting in its indifference, because a darkness that does not care about you is also a darkness that means you no harm. You are very nearly asleep. The words are slowing down around you, becoming less distinct, blending into each other the way that sounds blend in the final moments before sleep takes you. Still present, still forming patterns, but no longer requiring interpretation. Just sound, just breath, just the slow and ancient rhythm of a story that has been putting people to sleep for 3,000 years, and will go on doing so long after all of us are part of the compressed memory of the earth. Sleep well. The walls of Troy are standing, the watch goes on, and somewhere in the long, quiet night, a sentry pauses at the parapet of the northeastern tower, looks out at the plain, sees nothing but the dark and the fires and the stars, and is satisfied. He turns from the parapet. His boots make their familiar sound on the stone floor of the rampart walk. He breathes in the cold salt air and moves on, carrying his small lantern forward through the dark, lighting the next step, and the next, and the next, as far as the night requires. Sleep well. If this slow journey through the walls of ancient Troy helped settle your mind and ease you toward sleep, please consider leaving a like,
It takes just a moment, and it means more to this channel than you might imagine.
We are on our way to 1,000 subscribers here at Heyo, Boring History for Sleep. And every single like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer to that milestone. If you have a little sleepy hype left in you, send it our way in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're listening from and what time your clock shows as you drift off. It's oddly comforting to know who else is out there, settling towards sleep in the same quiet company of old stones and older stories. If you're new here and this is your first time falling asleep to boring history, welcome. There are more slow walks through ancient places waiting for you whenever you need them. Subscribe so you never have to search for them. Sleep well wherever you are. The walls still stand. The watch goes on.